This is Actualize Freedom, straight talk on growing clicks and conversions on Amazon FBA from people doing it every day. Now here's your host, digital marketing acrobat, Danny Kenji Carlson.
Today's episode of the Actualize Freedom podcast is sponsored by the new e-commerce podcast, The E-Commerce Leader, giving big thinking for small business. It's designed for e-commerce leaders eager to grow and protect their business. It's co-hosted by Jason Miles, Shopify store owner and educator, and Michael Veazey, an Amazon specialist. Just search for The E-Commerce Leader in your favorite podcast app and subscribe today. What's up, guys? Danny Carlson with the Actualize Freedom podcast, and today we are diving deep with a serial entrepreneur. This is a guy who has learned his marketing chops and has done so many different types of businesses. A lot of them did not work out and maybe were crazy ideas to begin with, but that's half the fun of being an entrepreneur, right? And so our guest today is a really interesting use case of what just happens when you come up with the ideas and you actually take action on all of them. And over the course of years, Kevin has had some success in a lot of different places, including selling on Amazon. So this is going to be a little bit different of an episode. We're going to dive into some Amazon things here, but more into the journey of entrepreneurship, and wherever that has taken Kevin has been some really interesting places. So welcome to the podcast, Kevin Urrutia. Did I say that name right?
Yeah, just Kevin Urrutia. Hey, Danny, thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Well, good to have you on here. So I want to start a little bit with your, the very beginning. How did you get into entrepreneurship in the first place? Was that something that you just really just had it in your mind and you wanted to be an entrepreneur, or was it kind of by accident?
Yeah, at least for me, I always known I wanted to do something when I was like 16 or 17. At this age, I knew I wanted to just build my own thing. I think we were talking about it earlier about some stuff I've done. When I was 17, I was already looking for places to hire coders to build websites for me. I think back in then, of course, everybody knows Upwork now. Back in the day, there was a website called Rent-A-Coder. And I used to go there all the time to find people to make stuff for me. And that's really kind of how I first got into learning programming. Was I wanted to hire somebody to make me a website, but I couldn't afford a really good person. I paid someone a really cheap price, and the website was really crappy. So then I was like, oh, I'm just going to learn programming myself. And then at this time, I started learning about TechCrunch, TechMeme, learning about Silicon Valley. And I was just like, oh my God, there's all these guys making tons of money in this sort of tech space. I need to be in this space as well. And then that led me to doing programming. And that led me to even being more into the startup ecosystem. I was learning about Hacker News, Y Combinator. I was working at an incubator to sort of incubate startups. I was doing that in college. And even in college, I was working in my own startups too, just because I wanted to do this so badly. And I knew that maybe I couldn't do it now, but I wanted to get to Silicon Valley so badly that I took a job there just to be there, because I knew I wanted to be there. I knew that this was the Mecca. And people always say was it worth it? I'm yeah, there's nothing like Silicon Valley, where people are just like you 24/7 and you're just learning every single day. And I tell people all the time, it's the best experience. And yeah, there's all these hubs and places outside of San Francisco, but when you're in there, it's it's completely different. And I've been to other places and I'm there's nothing like that. And I just went. I've never been to Silicon Valley until I got the job offer, and I was okay, let me just go do it. And yeah, I was so happy I did it.
Oh, and that's excellent. And I can just tell by your energy when you talk about it that you're the type of person that just gets really excited by this whole journey, right? The excitement of a startup and the idea of potentially just creating a huge rocket ship company, but then also the risk of potentially just crashing and burning and running out of money, right? So would you say that you're someone who just has the passion for just the whole excitement of the startup world?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I feel for me, it's the passion, excitement, but also I've always had this mindset, at least, of if this fails, I'll always find a job. At least for me, that's how we as programmers are taught. Hey, when you're building stuff, people just want to see what you can do. And if it doesn't work, there's other companies out there that be oh, I want these go-getters, starter people. At least for me, when I was working at my tech company, that's what we would look at. We would love people that told us hey, I tried these 3 projects, they didn't work. We're okay, show us your code. We're oh wow, you can think. If that shows us, at least when we were hiring them, that this person just can go and do it themselves. For us, like we would see resumes when someone would just have like a standard resume. They went to college and they didn't do anything. We're like, yeah, this person needs to get told what to do. This is probably not going to be a person we want to work with. We want to work with people that's going to like excite us and get us going. So for me, it was always that spirit of like, if I make something that fails, that's okay. I know there's people out there that are going to want that skill and be like, yeah, you did something, like come work with me because you're looking for other smart people too.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the real benefits of being a coder is that your backup option if your startup fails is multiple six-figure a year salary at some other larger software company, right? So consider that a risk maybe. Some of you on the listening to this podcast might know one of my old roommates that lived with me here in Bali. Very interesting. He had a very risky startup that just like was in a totally like super innovative space, and for a couple of years, it just wasn't working, and he's kind of had to take on more and more investor money. And he was at the point again where he needed another round, or else he was going to be out of money in like a couple months. And then just like boom, he got an acquisition offer, like got a couple $100,000 in the bank, and still retained a really good chunk of the company, and got hired on salary, right? Yeah. So I mean, that's just the kind of world that you live in there. Maybe you're just grinding away and getting nothing for years, and then all of a sudden, boom, it takes a turn for the good direction, right?
And exactly. And that's sort of, for me, that's kind of what I believe that, because that's what I read. And people like, yeah, this guy's company's failed, but he got acquired because they just want to hire the founder to just come in, lead like product or product development, because there's something about that. So for me, I was like, okay, that's, for me, like that risk was always kind of like, oh, okay. Like I never thought about it as a risk. I was just like, yeah, if I fail, I'll find something else. And it's not, for me, it wasn't a big deal of like, just for me, it was like, that helped me just make stuff. Cause that like freed up my mental space of just like, hey, like, what if I don't have money? I'm like, okay, if I want to have money, I'll go find something. But at this time in my life, I didn't care about money. I was mostly care about learning. Like, how can I get smarter? How can I do things? How can I build stuff? And that's what was exciting for me at that time.
Yeah. And so a lot of people in the coding and developing kind of world, you know, they're great at writing code, but when it comes to leading and growing a company, it's a totally different skill set, right? Maybe the critical thinking is similar, but there's a lot of the developer types that, you know, they couldn't be a leader or a manager if they just really tried. They would just be terrible at it. Yeah. So like, what do you think in that respect? Do you think you were like a natural leader that just learned how to code, or were you the coder who just like needed to really work on his management and leader skills?
I think I was that other one, a coder that needed to learn the management skills. I didn't realize how much of a different skill it is. It's just, yeah, you have the critical thinking part, but there's a lot of like being empathetic, talking to people, trying to see what their goals are. For me, for the longest time, that was actually the hardest part about building a team. I was always confused as to why you hired somebody and it's like, hey, why aren't they motivated to work? Why aren't they doing what I'm doing? Why aren't they working like 8 to 10? And I was just like, why can't people be just like me? And that was like my mindset at that time. I was like, what? And then as I got older and sort of like hired more people, I realized that like you can't have too many people like me, because then nothing gets done. You need the people that like kind of just like want the task broken down for them and just go and execute them, because that's what they're happy with. So I read that through books and learning and just like talking to the people. It's like, yeah, you can't have like all these like essentially like barrels doing like leading big projects. You need like the ammo, which is like your other employees. It's just like do the things they're told, because that's what they like and they don't want to be thinking about it. But yeah, that took me a long time to realize, because I was like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I just like, I need to get better at that. And then just reading books helps it. And I think when you read a book, and then it's like anything, you read a book, you kind of don't get it the first time, but then when you experience it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I remember once reading a management book about like birthdays at a company, and it's like, they're like, yeah, like when you have like 4 employees, you probably celebrate your birthdays every time someone has a birthday. And then as you get bigger, you realize that like, this is actually a disruption to the company, because you're celebrating 2 to 3 birthdays a week. And I was like, oh, that's so funny. That's like a weird thing. And then when I company grew to like 50 people, I'm like, oh, whoa, this is actually a disruption to the company. It's like, I need to, so now we batch the birthdays into like 1 month. And I was like, oh, this makes more sense. At that time, it didn't, right? So it's like, oh, this is crazy. Like, this is a real problem. I never thought about it. I'm like, but you don't know it until you experience it. So some stuff like reading back books, like, oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
That is so interesting too. And I'm sure when you're starting out, it's hard to imagine that you're like, oh, like I'm going to have a 50-person team that we're going to actually have to start grouping the birthdays together once per month. And it's like, you don't even think about that kind of stuff.
You don't think about it. Yeah.
Then you grow to it and the problem actually happens. It's a totally different thing, because celebrating birthdays is great. But at the end of the day, it's a company that it's a for-profit company where stuff needs to get done. Right.
Yeah, and it's just like people are just, and it's also just like getting the time to work of like everybody's schedule. It's like, okay, who can do that too? It's like 10 people can. Other it's like, okay, like let's just do like a lunchtime and like let's just celebrate all at once. And then if you can get the cake, that's great. If not, all right, let's move on. Yeah, it kind of sucks because like it just like when you're small, I think when you're small, it's always the best time. Like everybody probably says it, like at least founders listening to here, it's like when you're 3, 4 people, it's the best. But at that time, you don't know it. Because like you can just kind of do everything. It's like you kind of like friends with everybody. You kind of there's kind of a process, but there isn't no process. And it's like looking back, you're like I remember when I had one of my first companies, we would go to the gym at lunchtime and work out, like all the employees. And then like looking back now, we're like, wow, I can't believe we actually did like 2 hours at the gym during an actual work day. Like, why were we doing that? It's like these things that like you just like don't think about, but like now it's like a memory, like you'll never forget. So there's a lot of these things where it's like you can be perfect when starting a company or building a company, but remember a lot of times like this stuff is just kind of like more fun in the long run because 20 years from now, I'll always remember this. So whereas like what you did day to day, like you kind of won't forget. It's like, yeah, we did a company, but like these are the random things that we would do. We would like share all this stuff together. Like so yeah, I always tell people like just enjoy the beginning part of that aspect.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear how the journey changed for you as the company grows, right? Because as you grow, you go through all of these different problems. Like what's working for you at the level where you have 5 employees is going to completely break when as soon as you have 20 employees, right? You have to just completely redo a lot of the ways you're doing things.
Yeah.
So how did you really navigate those different changes? Did you have some mentors that really helped you navigate that? Or did you just learn through the school of hard knocks? How did that go?
Yeah, at the beginning, I really learned through reading books. I really like High Output Management by Andy Grove, a really great book on managing people. But in the beginning, it was really like unorganized. You really just didn't really know what to do, like what processes to set up, what systems to set up. And then as you sort of start learning more and more, reading more books, you start realizing that you need some sort of system or some sort of task list of things for people to do. And that just makes things more efficient. And I think at the beginning, or at least like sort of like after the stage of the beginning, you kind of are stuck in this phase of like, you don't want to like people to not be creative, but then because you want them to like think of ideas for the company, but at the same time, there's no structure. So it's more about the accountability. It's when there's accountability, things get done better, things get assessed better. Or like you can like just do things like for us, like for the Made company, for example, like there was no person that was like supposed to be on call on weekends. So it's kind of like a free for all. Like, hey, if you picked up, it was great. But then like sometimes no one picked up. So then it's like, well, like there was never a real person that was supposed to do it. So it's like no one gets in trouble. And that stuff like that's like, okay, like that's not helpful for the company because then we can't grow. That means we just lost like money, right? So stuff like that, it's like think about it. And sometimes it sucks because in the beginning, like I said before, it's a lot of your people that you know and like you're like friends and like whatever family. And it's like you don't want to like, yell at them. And so it's like that weird phase of but once you get over that phase, it's better because now it's like, hey guys, like what we like basically we had youth have a meeting. It's like, hey guys, what we were doing before isn't working. Like just so you know, like there's gonna be like reprimands or something like that, right? It's just like going off like we just can't be doing like this or else we won't grow, we're gonna stagnate. But then at least for me, as the company got bigger, I was like the CEO of the company. I pretty much knew that like I can't take the company forward. I just wasn't like there. So then I hired somebody else to come in and like basically replace me and like take over the company. And then I still run the company, but like I wasn't like the person managing the everyday operations because I just couldn't do it. I just like wasn't there. This is like maybe 5-6 years ago. So I tell people sometimes it's like, yeah, you can start the company, but doesn't mean you can take it to the next level. And you just have to know what you can do and what you can't do. And for me, I knew I couldn't do it. So I had to have somebody come in. And then now I'm just like, whoa, the best decision ever. Like I'm making more money and I'm not even working.
Oh, that's great. And let's talk about that for a little bit too, because what I think you're talking about is what Gino Wickman in a lot of his books describes as the visionary integrator relationship. And that was a big roadblock for me as well in the first couple of years, was just realizing that I am much more of a visionary. I come up with ideas at twice the speed as I can actually implement them. And the company was suffering without a well-defined integrator, which is the opposite end of that spectrum, a person who can really, put the work in and actually make sure everything happens, and is doing the day-to-day management and stuff like that. So is that what you're talking about? Which one did you hire out for? Were you the visionary or the integrator, or who did you bring in?
Yeah, so for me, I always tell people like I'm more like the visionary. I love thinking about ideas or things. But yeah, exactly what you said. You need that integrator to come in and be like, what's the visionary person saying? How do I break down their ideas into like actual things? And I think that's so important for a company to have. Like at least for me, once I got that person in, it was like night and day. It's like, whoa, like stuff is getting done, and it's like stuff is just getting managed better. So yeah, it's super important. I think I read that too in a book too. So for me, I was like, oh, I think I'm like this visionary type, and I tell people it's like it's okay to like let go of things. Like people sometimes get so caught up in like I want to be the CEO. I want to be the, I'm like it's fine. Like I'm still the company. I don't run it, and it's like I have more time than ever. But I think it has to do more with like identity. Sometimes you feel like you lose your identity. I'm like no, like I'm fine. Like I'm still just relaxing and hanging out, and it's still my company. Like I still own 100% of it, so it's not like I lost anything. But like sometimes people feel like it's that outside perception of people. Like when people ask you, "What do you do?" It's like, "Oh, I thought that was your company." It's like, "Oh, you don't run anymore." And sometimes you're like, "Oh, yeah." It's like, well, they don't know what to say.
Yeah. I mean, identity is a big one for entrepreneurs, just getting wrapped up in the identities. And it can be great when your company is going really well and things are great, but it can also be the double-edged sword that when things are not going good in your company, then your own personal self-worth can take the hit as well, right? I think that's a big problem for a lot of entrepreneurs is just wrapping up their own ego and their own emotions in their business way too much. And so how do you navigate something like that? As someone who's been through so many startups and so many businesses, how do you navigate that whole issue?
Yeah, I think that's like such a big issue. And I didn't realize how big it was, at least the first 2 years of doing my company. Like for example, like when you have sales, you feel so good. It's like, oh my God, like you're like the best in the world. And then like you don't have sales the next day, you're like so depressed. Like you don't want to talk to anybody. It still happens, even for me at the current company I'm at. When I'm like talking to somebody and I close a lead, I'm like, oh, you feel so good. And then like you go like a day without like closing a lead, you like feel depressed. But like I've gotten a lot better at it. And it's just sort of like over time, you realize that like you can't really control it too much. You kind of like obviously control certain things of it. But I don't know. For me, it's like I just kind of mentally get over it. I'm like, oh, okay, like we're still doing well. Like the business is growing. Instead of don't look at it as like day-to-day numbers, look at it like month-to-month numbers now. And that's sort of how we think about it. It's like, oh, monthly we're still growing. And yeah, we had a bad day, but yeah, I think it's I don't know. I don't know how to get over it. I just tell people like you kind of eventually just snap out of it. At least I did. And it's like, yeah, it's like, why are you like getting email? It's like about stuff like this. But like, yeah, it's tough. It's really, really tough. In the beginning, it was so tough. And I just like didn't know what to do because I'm like, I don't want to even think about anything besides work, even though you can't do anything. It's like 10 o'clock at night. You're like, you literally can't do anything. So it's like, let's like get over it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience too, is that it was much more difficult to deal with in my first couple of years of business when I didn't have the experience dealing with situations like that. And I would just mentally beat myself up for things when things like didn't work out the way I wanted to, or they weren't growing as fast as I wanted to. I would just mentally beat myself up over it. But over the years, like you said, still things happen. Like, you know, we come short on our monthly target or something like that. And it's just easier to deal with. Right. It's just like you get a little bit thicker skin, right? Like the bully at the playground who was, calling you those names doesn't really hurt anymore after a while. And you just get thicker skin to it. Right. And I think that as an entrepreneur, it's a very important skill to also just be working on your own mental headspace and keeping your stress levels okay and just becoming a resilient minded entrepreneur to deal with crazy situations, because just as an entrepreneur in general, you're just going to have to deal with more crazy situations than the average person will. So I think that's an important skill. What do you think?
I think it's probably the most important skill, because even for me, people always tell me like, what's the best thing about an entrepreneur? I'm like, it's because every day is so random. Like I will literally have like I was telling people like, I'm like enjoying my vacation. I'm like getting dinner with a friend. And all of a sudden my employee called me. It's like, hey, so I just like broke my arm and I just like can't come to work. I'm like, wait, what? How'd you break your arm? She's like, oh, I was riding a scooter. I'm just like, I would never think that like someone would be riding a scooter right now and breaking their arm. Just like all these like crazy things that like just come up, and they always surprise you. Like a random person's like, oh, by the way, like I'm moving to this place. I'm like, wait, what? Like she's like, oh yeah, it just happened. I was like, okay, like you could tell me like a week ago, but that's fine. It's just like, yeah, it's like all these like things. I always tell people that's the most exciting, and like I'll wake up and it's like someone will tell me something random. I'm like, what? Like, what's crazy? Like I would never like in my mind would think this situation would be real right now, but okay, let's try to figure out how to deal with it. And then you just get better at it. And then it's like, at least for me, when I was running like the cleaning company, that was like, people had like cleaning issues for like the most random things. Like people would say like, we sold this, people would say we took in this. People would be like, yeah, like I came home and like my penny was moved from like a desk, and we're just like, wait, what? And like they literally will complain about things. I'm just like, this is so crazy. Like people are just like interesting. So that kind of like builds up your mental like thickness and your skin thickness of things that can happen. But I think that's probably the most important thing is just expect the unexpected and just deal with it. It's like you can't think of every situation or else like you'll go crazy.
Yeah, and that's where your value as an entrepreneur is, right? As an entrepreneur, the definition is that you are creating value in a place where that value doesn't exist already, right? If you're providing the same value as an employee in a well-defined position, that's worth a certain amount of value because it's well-defined what you should do and what should be done. And entrepreneurs can make massive, massive amounts of money because they can create value that is not being currently satisfied. Right? It says these paths that aren't well defined, they're finding the problems and then creating value out of solving those problems, right? And by definition, that means you're going to have to be doing things that aren't well defined, or there is no best practices on ways to do these. And you're going to have to deal with situations that have never been dealt with before in any kind of business, especially with how fast things are moving in today's internet world. So just know that that's something you're going to have to deal with. But on the upside of that, actually, like one really random thing that happened recently in our company is our employee Mark got a Kenji ROI tattoo, and he shows up to the team meeting with a big tattoo over his heart. And it's like the most hilarious thing is like, I didn't know what to think at first. It's like, yeah, really? Like, why would someone actually get the company logo tattooed on their chest? But oh my God, I guess it's a compliment. But you're creating a company that's it's got all these team members and is just like creating real things in the world, then random things will happen. It's a beast by itself.
Yeah, that's like, I think that's the craziest part of entrepreneurs is that randomness. And if you can deal with it, great. I've talked to people too, and they're just like, you can get really stressed out about it. And that's an other flip side. It's like, you realize that you don't want to be entrepreneur. And that's fine because you realize you can't take that stress and you want a different sort of lifestyle. And that's fine. But like you said before, it's entrepreneurs, that's what they're there to bring more value and think about things like this and bring other people together.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you quickly as well about, I think a lot of people, they hear someone like you who's done, 6 different startups and all these different things, and they just assume that you are just an incredible multitasker and you just, somehow are able to do all of it at once. Right. But for most people, that's not the case. Right. So I'm interested to hear what your journey has been. Like, were you focusing on only one project at a time, or do you typically have 3 projects going at the same time? How does that work with you?
Yeah, usually for us, we have like one project going at a time, and then that's sort of where you put your full focus energy on. And then similar to what I said before, after like 2-3 years, I'm like, okay, like I want to do something else because I get kind of bored, or I want to do something different. And then I just hire somebody to come in and replace me, and then be like, okay, let's run the company. And like, I'll just have like meetings with them every week to talk about strategy. For example, like my outdoor gear company, I have like 4 employees in that one, but I don't really touch it day to day. I just said like, hey, here are the people you need to contact for supply chain. Here's the retail people, and let's talk about your marketing. Here you go hire your own marketing team, and then talk to me about the strategy, and let's see if it makes sense. I kind of always tell people like, you want to hire these people that kind of like their own mini CEOs, that then they can do it, but then there's security of a job that they can still, you still get paid without having to be like worrying about that. And a lot of people like that. It's a great thing. So that's how I think about it. And for me, I thought about it because it was like kind of how a lot of these venture firms are set up, where it's like they have like these sort of like incubators internally, where it's like there's like the partners, and then inside you have like these like entrepreneurs that will build things but get paid, but then like the company, the VC firm owns it. And that's kind of how I've always thought about it, where I don't want to be doing all like the day-to-day work after a certain amount of years, because I want to be just doing other stuff. And so that's how I've always done it, and then how I've been able to build stuff. I like to just build it, get the process in place, because I like to learn how to do the things. And then once I learn, I'm like, okay, I don't want to contact my suppliers anymore for new inventory. Like I want to hire somebody to do that because it's just boring now. So let me just go and find somebody that just do that. So that's how I thought about it. But I think it's tough to just do everything at once. And similar to like I said before, it's not just me. I have a team now that I hire, and it helps me do it. So I think the biggest skill that I've learned as an entrepreneur is hiring people. In the beginning, you kind of want to do everything yourself, and then you don't realize how much you're bootstrapping, or how much you're sort of like holding yourself back by not bringing on people, because you want to make a little bit more profit for your own self. Once I realized, hey, like let me take a less salary cut, and yes, the next 6 months might hurt, but then if you hire the right person, you'll make more money from them in the long run, because then you're not going to be you should be bringing more revenue because they should be helping the company. If you don't, that means you probably hired somebody bad. So then, hire somebody new.
Yeah, well, and I'm a strong believer that hiring is probably the most important skill of an entrepreneur, and especially for a startup entrepreneur where like you are the person who is defining everything. You're the person who is in charge of bringing all the new people and creating the systems and everything like that. And if you're not bringing on the right people, I think a lot of people really underestimate the negative cost or the opportunity cost that's associated with that. And I certainly did for the first couple of years of hiring. And making all my hiring mistakes of hiring people for the wrong reasons, like maybe because I liked them, not because they actually were the right fit for the role, and just like really understanding that aspect, I think is so important to dive into. Like as an example, online entrepreneurs, we all understand the value of software, right? And we would never choose the wrong software for the wrong operation, right? It like doesn't really make sense. I'm not going to go try to use QuickBooks to go do like some spreadsheets like Excel or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. But all the time, as entrepreneurs, we just throw our hands up like, whatever, I'm going to choose the best out of these 10 applicants that came in because I'm tired of going through job interviews.
Yeah.
And you just take someone on who's completely the wrong software for the wrong role. And it's just going to cause so much problems down the line. So what kind of tips do you have for us when it comes to choosing the right team members and really making sure that you're bringing on the right person for whatever role you're hiring for?
Yeah. So for us, I think it was exactly what you said. It's more the opportunity cost. It's not really the money. Like you can pay somebody, you lose some money, but it's more the opportunity cost of growing your startup. But for us here, we have a process for hiring. For us, we have a minimum of 4 interviews, and then we also do 5 reference checks on the person we bring on board. It sounds like a lot, but you as a smaller company, as a startup, you can't potentially risk hiring a bad person. Whereas a bigger company that's 1,000 people, you hire one bad person, it's like, all right, like they'll just get absorbed into the company. Where for you as a smaller company, that person counts. Like, and the thing too, it's like everybody in the company will see it and be like, oh wow, this person is not good. Like, it's like maybe like what's going on, like the company level goes down, and then it kind of demoralizes everybody. So I tell people the biggest thing that you can do that helps with hiring is always get at least 4 to 5 references and actually call them. A lot of people say like, I'll get a reference, but they don't actually call. And it's a weird thing, but I'm like, call them. Like actually like, and like the thing is references need to be like, not their friends. Like Google them before you call them. Be like, okay, like it seems like this guy and him are like friends on Twitter. Like it's clearly not a good reference, right? So it's like, you need to like think about it. And like I kind of said before, it's like, it's not just randomly picking. It's like, okay, like, yes, okay, this guy's like a VP of marketing somewhere. Oh, okay, he seems like he will do it. And then people sometimes, I tell people sometimes too, it's like making sure when you call the references, you tell them to reference check. And the reason why I tell that is because you're not really calling them as like a friend. When it's a friend, it's different sort of like, you kind of know when it's a friend versus a reference, especially when it's someone that's professional. Someone professional will say, hey, how's Kevin? What they'll say is like, when you know it's a good person that you're about to hire, they'll say, oh, Kevin is really task oriented. He gets the job done. When you know it's an okay reference, you'll say, oh, he's a good person. And so then, okay, when they leave with a good person, they're covering all this like other stuff because like good person is a nice way of saying he's not that good, but he's cool person. So I always tell people like, think about these sort of words and what they mean, because no one's going to say like, oh yeah, he sucks. Or at least most people don't, right? But like they'll say it in a nicer way. So just little tips like that, just pick it up and see, and then learn from there. But I think references is like the most important thing that you could probably be doing.
Yeah, well, that's a really important point that you're making about the references, because there's just some weird thing in the job world where people just very, very often, even if that employee was a complete nightmare, they will not trash talk them because a lot of people are uncomfortable talking negatively about someone. But secondly, employers are often scared of getting sued or like some other kind of retribution from that past employee, right? Because employees can do things. They can, do things to cause some shit with their past employers, right? So I think a lot of employers are, they're not going to tell you straight if they were a total nightmare. So very important point to pick up on those subtle cues of like, okay, well, they're not saying any good things.
Yeah.
So
it's like, when they don't say anything good, we're like, okay, like, oh yeah, he was a really great person to talk to. Like, it's like, okay, like, it's like, but whereas like when you have a star reference, they'll be like, yeah, like they were leading this project, they were able to execute this. They'll give you like, you'll know when it's good. It's kind of like when you talk to somebody smart, it's like, okay, this person's smart. Like, okay, yeah. It's like when you know, it's like one of the things like you'll know. And after you do so many, it becomes easier and you kind of pick it up. So, okay, great. Okay, that's perfect. Let's go. That's why I think 5 is really important too, because it just shows that this person's been in the field for a long time. And another key thing is if they like take a long time to like send you those references, it's like, okay, you should know people that you can call, like at least for like anybody knows like, hey, I know this, I worked with this person like 3 years ago and he can vouch for me. And yes, of course, maybe if it's like a junior position, then maybe not. But like, let's say you're hiring for like a VP or senior, they have people or like other managers with them that can vouch for them. So it's not a hard thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, awesome, Kevin. This has been a super valuable episode. Really appreciate you coming on here. So if people want to reach out to you or learn more about what you do online, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, best place is just go to Voy Media. That's our website, or just email me, kevin@voymedia.com. That's the best place.
Awesome. And for all the podcast listeners too, you also have your own podcast, right?
Yeah, so it's called Digital Marketing Fastlane. We mainly talk about Facebook ads and marketing, more like a broad sort of podcast, but really a big focus on Facebook ads.
Awesome, man. Well, based on the value you're dropping here, I'm sure that is a very valuable podcast as well. So guys, we'll put links to all those resources in the show notes at kenjiroi.com/blog. So definitely check those out. And Kevin, thanks so much for your time, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
For show notes and resources mentioned in this episode, visit kenjiroi.com.